Judge Samuel Holloway sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin as he thought about what had just happened in his courtroom. When Clint Eastwood first walked in and said he would be his own lawyer, Judge Samuel didn't take him seriously. He thought it would be funny, maybe even a little embarrassing for the famous actor. After all, Clint wasn't a real lawyer, he was a movie star. What did he know about the law? Judge Samuel expected Clint to struggle with legal terms, to get confused, or maybe even ask for help. He thought this trial would be like watching someone try to play chess without knowing the rules. It might be entertaining, but it wouldn't go well for Clint. The people in the courtroom seemed to feel the same way. At first there was laughter. Reporters whispered to each other, scribbling notes. Some people smirked, others nudged their friends and grinned. Even Victor Langston, the rich real estate developer Clint was suing, sat back in his chair with a little chuckle. His expensive lawyer, Victor Ethan, looked amused as well, like he had already won the case before it even started. Judge Samuel had seen many trials in his career, but this was something new. A Hollywood legend, a man famous for playing tough guys in movies, now standing in front of him, ready to fight in a real courtroom. The judge adjusted his robe, still smiling a little. "All right, Mr. Eastwood," he said, tapping his gavel. "You may proceed with your opening statement." Clint Eastwood didn't rush. He didn't shuffle his papers nervously like some first-time lawyers do. Instead, he took his time, standing up slowly, placing his hands lightly on the table in front of him. He looked straight at the judge, his blue eyes sharp and steady. The room grew quiet. It wasn't a dramatic silence, it was something else. It was the kind of silence that came when Clint Eastwood walked onto a movie set. The kind of silence that told people he was about to say something important. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, low, and steady. "In 1992, I bought a piece of land in Carmel by the sea," Clint said. "That land was mine. The property lines were clearly marked. I paid my taxes. I followed all the rules." His voice didn't waver. He wasn't acting. He was just telling the truth. "But last year, Mr. Langston and his company decided my land wasn't mine anymore," Clint continued. "They built on my property without permission. They ignored boundaries. They ignored permits. And they ignored me." He reached into his case file and pulled out a stack of papers, setting them neatly on the table. Then, just as carefully, he pulled out photographs, clear, sharp images that showed exactly what had happened. "These pictures," Clint said, sliding them forward, "show what my land looked like before construction. And these," he pushed another set of photos closer, "show how Langston's company built over my property little by little, until a part of their luxury condo was standing where it didn't belong." The courtroom, which had been filled with laughter just moments ago, was now completely silent. No one whispered. No one chuckled. Even Langston's lawyer, Victor Ethan, sat up straighter. Ethan finally cleared his throat and stood up, adjusting his expensive suit. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, flashing a confident smile, "if I may." Before he could finish, Clint raised a hand, stopping him. "I'm not done," Clint said. The way he said it was calm. Not rude, not loud, just firm. But it was so unexpected that Ethan actually froze for a moment, blinking in surprise. Judge Samuel hesitated. Normally, a lawyer wouldn't be able to silence the opposing side like that. But somehow in that moment the judge found himself nodding. "Go ahead, Mr. Eastwood," the judge said. Clint reached into his case file again and pulled out more documents, emails, legal notices, and letters. "These," he said, laying them down, "are records of every attempt I made to resolve this issue before coming to court. I sent letters. I called. I tried to work this out the right way. I gave Mr. Langston's company every opportunity to fix their mistake." Then for the first time, Clint looked directly at Victor Langston. "They chose to ignore me." Langston shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer, Ethan, finally found his voice again. He let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, "you've certainly done your homework and I admire the effort. But with all due respect, you're not a lawyer. These legal matters are complicated. Yes, you've presented some evidence, but do you even understand the nuances of property law?" Clint didn't look offended. He didn't get angry. He simply leaned forward, meeting Ethan's eyes. "I understand the law just fine," he said, his voice even and strong. "And I understand when someone's breaking it." Ethan let out another short laugh, trying to regain his confidence. "You think this is like one of your movies, don't you?" he said. "The lone hero standing up against the system." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to formally object to this entire charade. This case deserves a real trial, not a performance." Judge Samuel looked at Clint, waiting to see how he would respond. Clint nodded slightly. You want a performance? He said. Go watch one of my movies. Then he gestured around the courtroom. This is real, he said. And I take real things seriously. The room was dead silent again. Judge Samuel let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. When this trial had started, he had expected something completely different. He had expected a joke, a disaster, a famous old actor fumbling his way through a legal battle he didn't understand. But that wasn't what was happening. Instead, Clint Eastwood had walked into this courtroom and done something no one expected. He had spoken clearly. He had shown strong evidence. He had made a real case, not with theatrics but with facts. And now, looking at him, the judge saw something he hadn't seen before. Clint Eastwood wasn't just an actor playing a hero. He wasn't pretending to fight for justice. He was really doing it. Judge Samuel leaned forward, clasping his hands together, his tone more serious now. All right, Mr. Eastwood, he said. You've explained your argument. The trial was just beginning. But one thing was already clear. Clint Eastwood wasn't here to lose. Mr. Ethan, do you want to respond? Victor Ethan, the fancy lawyer for Victor Langston, stood up with a little smile. He didn't look nervous, not yet. Your Honor, Ethan said, I respect Mr. Eastwood's confidence, but this case isn't as simple as he says. He turned to face the people in the courtroom. He looked comfortable, like a man who was used to winning. This is just a small mistake about where the property lines are, Ethan continued. Now, I know Mr. Eastwood thinks someone built on his land, but we have a lot of papers that say otherwise. He pointed to his own stack of legal papers, all neatly placed inside fancy leather folders. Mr. Eastwood did a good job putting his case together, Ethan said, but reading a few law books isn't enough. The law is about understanding details, history, and most of all, experience. He turned to Clint with a smile that wasn't very friendly. Mr. Eastwood, I know you've played sheriffs and detectives in your movies, Ethan said. And, to be honest, I've enjoyed some of them. He gave a small laugh. But this isn't Dirty Harry, and it's not Unforgiven either, Ethan said. This is real life. And in real life, you can't just shoot your way out of a problem in court. Some people in the courtroom laughed again, but it didn't sound real. It was like they were laughing just because Ethan wanted them to. Clint sat at his table. He didn't laugh. He didn't blink. He didn't move. He just adjusted his papers, slow and calm. Then when he finally spoke, his voice was steady and strong. You're right, Clint said. This isn't a movie. He stood up, moving slowly, placing both hands on the table in front of him. And I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Ethan. The laughter stopped. Clint picked up a stack of legal papers and started flipping through them. You want to talk about experience? Clint said. Let's talk about facts. He held up a big aerial photograph of his property from before the construction started. This is my land in 2021, he said, pointing to the marked boundary lines that were legally recorded. Then he picked up another photo. This is my land in 2023. See that? He pointed at a part of the photo where Langston's building had crossed onto his property. That's your client's building, Clint said. On my land. Ethan shifted a little in his seat, but Clint wasn't done. He pulled out a printed email. This is the first cease and desist letter I sent to Langston's company when their construction started creeping onto my property. No response. He flipped to another page. This is the second notice. No response. He flipped to a third. This is the third. Clint looked up at Ethan, his eyes locked onto him. See a pattern here? He asked. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Eastwood, Ethan said, trying to sound calm, property disputes aren't always simple. There are a lot of rules. Clint raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. You ignored the law until you got caught, he said. The room went silent. Even Judge Samuel looked surprised. He had seen many people try to represent themselves in court, but none had the confidence Clint Eastwood did. He wasn't lost. He wasn't guessing. He was calm, careful, and most importantly, right? Ethan forced a small laugh, trying to shake it off. Your Honor, Ethan said, I think things are getting a little dramatic here. This is still just the opening argument. And while Mr. Eastwood knows how to put on a show, this case is about legal details. Judge Samuel had thought this case would be simple at first, but now he wasn't so sure. He folded his hands, looking back and forth between Ethan and Eastwood. Very well, the judge said. Mr. Ethan, you'll have your chance to defend your client, but for now, I want to hear more from Mr. Eastwood. Clint gave a small nod and sat down. His face gave away nothing. Ethan sat down too, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. It was clear now, underestimating Clint Eastwood had been a mistake. And Ethan wasn't the only one who had made that mistake. By the time court ended for the day, the whole story had spread like wildfire. News reporters camped outside the Monterey County Courthouse. Their cameras were rolling, their voices excited. The headlines wrote themselves. Clint Eastwood takes on the legal system and wins round 1. Go ahead, make my case. Hollywood legend stuns the courtroom. Judge underestimated Eastwood, and now he regrets it. Social media exploded. Videos from inside the courtroom, some taken secretly by people in the audience, spread online. Clips showed Eastwood standing tall, presenting his evidence while Ethan struggled to keep up. Legal experts debate the case on TV. Some laughed. Others were impressed. No one thought Clint Eastwood would actually know the law, one expert said on a news show. But he's done his homework. He's sharp, disciplined, and honest. He commands that courtroom better than some real lawyers I've seen. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters rushed toward Clint as he stepped through the doors. Mr. Eastwood, did you expect to make such a strong impression? One reporter asked. Clint adjusted his hat, gave a small shrug and said, I just came to tell the truth. Do you really think you can win this case without a lawyer? Another reporter asked. Clint stopped, turning to look directly into the cameras. Justice isn't about how expensive your lawyer is, he said. It's about what's right. Then he walked to his car, ignoring the flashing lights from all the cameras. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. Reporters filled the seats, eager to see if Clint's winning streak would continue, or if the other side would finally put him on the defensive. Langston's lawyer, Victor Ethan, was done playing nice. He straightened his tie, walked up to the judge's bench and spoke smoothly. Your Honor, before we continue, I have a request, Ethan said. Because of all the media attention, I think we need to make sure we're following the law properly. I request that Mr. Eastwood be required to hire a lawyer or drop his case. A wave of whispers ran through the courtroom. Judge Samuel looked at Eastwood. Mr. Eastwood, do you have a response? Clint stood up, resting his hands lightly on the table. I do, he said, his voice steady. This is a public court, he continued. Yes, the media is watching. But the media didn't build on my land. The media didn't ignore my cease and desist letters. And the media didn't file this lawsuit. I did. He turned to Ethan. You want me to get a lawyer because I'm making you nervous? Ethan forced a tight-lipped smile. Hardly, he said. I just think the legal process is complicated even for experienced lawyers. Clint nodded. I imagine it is, he said. He picked up another document. But last I checked, the Constitution doesn't say I need a lawyer to defend my own land, Clint said. Unless you think a man can't stand up for himself anymore. The murmuring in the room grew louder. Judge Samuel cleared his throat. Mr. Ethan, the judge said, I understand your concerns, but Mr. Eastwood has the right to represent himself. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had lost another round. As the trial continued, Clint called his first witness, Jacob Reynolds, a retired land surveyor with 30 years of experience in Monterey County. Mr. Reynolds, Clint said, walking toward the witness stand. You've checked my property records, correct? Yes, sir, Reynolds said. I've worked with Mr. Eastwood for decades. His property line hasn't changed since the early 90s. Clint nodded and held up a document. Can you confirm that this is the original property deed? Reynolds glanced at it and nodded. Yes, he said. This clearly says the land in question belongs to Mr. Eastwood. Clint turned to Thomas. That's the law right there in black and white. Ethan, the other lawyer, jumped up from his chair. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Eastwood is not allowed to explain the law to Thomas. Judge Samuel thought for a moment, then sighed. Sustained. Mr. Eastwood, please keep your questions within legal rules. Clint nodded. Fine. I'll keep it simple. He turned back to the witness, Mr. Reynolds. Has there ever been a problem about my property line before? No, Reynolds said firmly. Clint looked at the judge. No further questions. Now it was Ethan's turn. He stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked toward Reynolds with a confident smile. Mr. Reynolds, you've been a land surveyor for a long time, haven't you? 35 years, Reynolds confirmed. And in that time, have you ever seen mistakes with property lines? Not on purpose, but just mistakes. Reynolds shifted in his seat. Sometimes, but not in this case. The lines are clear. Ethan nodded. That's your opinion. Clint leaned back in his chair, watching Ethan try to find something wrong with the testimony. But there was nothing wrong with it. After a few more failed attempts, Ethan sighed. No further questions. The court session ended for the day, and Judge Samuel found himself studying Clint Eastwood. This case had been against Clint from the start. No fancy lawyers, no legal training, no big law firm backing him. The judge had thought Clint would struggle, like most people who try to defend themselves in court. But Clint wasn't struggling, he was winning. As the judge banged the gavel, he realized something else. Hollywood might have taught Clint Eastwood how to deliver justice in movies, but in real life, the system wasn't ready for him. The next day, the courtroom was silent as Clint Eastwood called his next witness, Victor Langston. Langston was a rich real estate developer, a man who made millions building fancy properties. He walked to the witness stand with a confident smile. He wore an expensive suit and adjusted his tie before sitting down. His lawyer, Ethan, approached first. "Mr. Langston, just to be clear, do you believe your company followed the law when you started building?" Langston nodded smoothly. "Absolutely. We checked everything before we began." Ethan smiled. "So, in your opinion, could Mr. Eastwood just be mistaken about where his property ends?" Langston smirked. "That sounds about right." The courtroom murmured. Clint sat at his table, hands folded, waiting. Ethan stepped back. No further questions. A hush fell over the courtroom as Clint slowly stood up. He didn't grab any papers. He didn't look at any notes. He simply walked toward the witness stand, calm and steady. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "You just told us you believe I'm mistaken about my own land." Langston smirked again. "That's right." Clint nodded, then walked over to the table where the evidence was stacked. He picked up the first photo, an overhead shot of the land before any construction had started. He held it up. "Do you recognize this?" Langston barely glanced at it. "Looks like some property." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Not just some property. My property. This was taken before your company started building." Langston shrugged. "If you say so." Clint didn't react. He picked up another photo. This one showed the half-built luxury condos creeping over his land. "How about this one?" Langston shifted slightly. "I assume that's our project." Clint nodded. Holding up both photos side by side, he asked, "Can you explain why part of your building is on my land?" Langston let out a slow breath, annoyed. "Mr. Eastwood, property disputes happen all the time. Sometimes the lines get a little blurry. It's a complicated business." Clint took a step forward. "Blurry?" His voice was still calm, but now there was steel in it. "Boundaries don't get blurry by accident. They get ignored." He carefully placed the photos down and picked up a document. His cease and desist letter, the one he had sent to Langston's company months before the lawsuit. "Did you receive this letter?" Langston hesitated, then sighed. "I'm sure my legal team handled it." Clint's voice remained steady. "That's not what I asked. Did you personally receive this letter?" Langston shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, I suppose I did." Clint turned toward Thomas. "And after receiving this letter, after I told you clearly that you were building on land that wasn't yours, did you stop construction?" Langston's jaw tightened. The courtroom was silent. Finally, Langston cleared his throat. "No," he admitted. A murmur rippled through the room. Clint didn't react. He didn't push. He simply let Thomas absorb that answer. Then, after a long pause, he said, "No further questions." As Clint walked back to his seat, he saw the Thomas members' faces. At first, some had been amused, even skeptical. But now they were serious. Judge Samuel rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of what had just happened. He had underestimated Eastwood. Everyone had. And now, piece by piece, Clint was tearing apart the defense's case. Ethan stood, looking irritated. He buttoned his jacket and approached Langston again. "Mr. Langston," he began, his voice smooth. "Just to be clear, when you started construction, did you believe you were within your legal rights?" Langston straightened his tie. "Yes." "And did you knowingly break the law on purpose?" Langston shook his head. "No. Any mistakes were just that, mistakes." Ethan nodded and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is a businessman. He follows the law as best he can. If mistakes were made, they were accidental." Clint leaned back, watching. He had already made his point. He didn't need to object. Judge Samuel sighed. "We'll take a short break." As the judge banged the gavel, the courtroom filled with chatter. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "This isn't just about property anymore. It's Clint Eastwood versus big business." Another nodded. "And he's winning." At the defense table, Ethan leaned in close to Langston. "We need a new strategy," he whispered. "If we don't stop him soon, this case is going to spin out of control." Langston scowled, his confidence fading. "Do whatever you have to." Across the courtroom, Clint sat back down, calm as ever. He wasn't worried. He wasn't flustered. Because he knew one thing. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to fight dirty. You just need to let the facts speak for themselves. When the court reconvened, the mood in the room had changed. Ethan, who had been so confident at the start, was starting to crack. Langston, who once thought Clint was just an old actor playing lawyer, now sat stiffly in his chair, jaw clenched. Clint, however, was as calm as ever. Judge Samuel turned to Ethan. "Mr. Ethan, you may call your next witness." Ethan stood and buttoned his jacket. "Your Honor, the defense calls Henry Talbot, senior land assessor, to the stand." An older man in his 60s walked up, looking serious. Ethan smiled. "Mr. Talbot, have you ever seen property disputes caused by outdated surveys or small errors in property lines?" Talbot nodded. "Yes, it happens more than people think." Ethan turned to Thomas. "So, could it be possible that Mr. Eastwood's claim is based on an old map?" Talbot hesitated. "I suppose it's possible." Ethan smiled. "Thank you. No further questions." Clint was already standing. Slowly he walked to the stand. His boots tapped against the floor. "Mr. Talbot," he said, locking eyes with the man. "How often do developers like Mr. Langston ignore property lines on purpose, assuming no one will stop them?" Talbot blinked. "Excuse me?" Clint continued, "You've been in this job for 35 years. How often do developers knowingly build on land that isn't theirs?" Talbot hesitated. He glanced at Langston, then at Ethan. Finally, he cleared his throat. I can't say for sure." Clint nodded. "Let me help you out." He pulled out a document. "This is a record of past property disputes involving Langston's company. Take a look." Talbot adjusted his glasses, reading. His face tensed. "There are 5 cases," he admitted. Clint raised an eyebrow. "5? And how many were settled out of court?" Talbot swallowed. "All of them." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Clint turned to Thomas and spoke in a strong, clear voice. "This isn't just a little mistake," he said. "This is a pattern. This man has done this before. He's been caught, but every time he just pays money to get out of trouble." Suddenly, Ethan, the lawyer for the other side, jumped up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This has nothing to do with the case." Judge Samuel let out a deep sigh. He had to admit Clint had a good point. Overruled. "Mr. Eastwood, please stay focused on the case." Clint nodded. He turned back to Talbot, the witness. "One more question," Clint said. "Have you personally looked at the official survey of my land?" Talbot hesitated. "Not personally, no." Clint nodded again and looked at the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Clint walked back to his seat, Ethan, the other lawyer, looked upset. His own witness had just admitted that he hadn't even checked the most important piece of evidence. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to his client, Victor Langston. Langston was whispering angrily. "This is a joke," Langston muttered. "I'm paying you to win, not to let some cowboy embarrass us." Ethan clenched his jaw and spoke softly. "Relax. Clint got in a few good hits, but we're still ahead." Langston narrowed his eyes. "Are we?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and spoke to the judge. "Your Honor, we would like to give our closing arguments now." Judge Samuel sighed and nodded. "Very well, Mr. Ethan. You may begin." Ethan straightened his jacket, walked toward Thomas and began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Thomas, we've all been entertained these past few days. Mr. Eastwood has put on quite a show. But justice is not a movie. It's not about drama or emotions. It's about the law. And the law is not on Mr. Eastwood's side." Ethan gestured around the room. "Property laws, land disputes, legal rules, these things are complicated. Mr. Eastwood may be passionate, but passion alone doesn't prove ownership." He nodded confidently. "My client followed all the correct steps before starting construction. Any claims against him are just misunderstandings, not bad intentions. We respect Mr. Eastwood's dedication, but we ask you to focus on the facts, not the drama." With that, Ethan walked back to his seat, looking satisfied. For a long moment, Clint didn't move. Then, slowly, he stood up and walked toward Thomas. He moved with calm confidence, his boots clicking against the floor. Then he spoke. "You know," Clint said, "I've been in a lot of movies over the years." He paused, letting the silence settle. "But not a single one of them was about letting bad people get away with what they knew was wrong." He turned to Langston and pointed. "Mr. Langston knew exactly what he was doing. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd take a payoff like all the others. He thought he could steal my land, build his fancy condos, and walk away richer." Clint let his words hang in the air. Then he looked back at Thomas, meeting each of their eyes. But justice isn't about money. It's not about fancy lawyers or expensive suits. It's about doing what's right. He took a step back. That's all I have to say. Then he walked back to his seat. The room was silent, his words still heavy in the air. Judge Samuel nodded solemnly. Court is adjourned until tomorrow, when Thomas will deliver his verdict. The trial was almost over. The courtroom was different that morning. The usual buzz and chatter were gone. Instead, there was a tense, heavy silence. Today was important. Today Thomas would decide. Judge Samuel Holloway adjusted his glasses and looked serious. Mr. Eastwood, do you have any more witnesses before we move to closing arguments? Clint Eastwood stood as steady as ever. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mr. Lucas Merrick to the stand. Most people in the courtroom had never heard that name before. But at the defense table, Ethan and Langston immediately looked uneasy. Langston frowned. Who the hell is Merrick? Ethan shook his head. No idea. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in his early 50s walked in. He wore a work jacket and jeans, his boots scuffing the floor. His face was tanned and rough from years of working outside. He walked up to the stand and sat down. The court clerk swore him in. Clint walked forward, taking his time. Mr. Merrick, Clint said. What do you do for a living? Merrick cleared his throat. I'm a construction gains. Been doing this work for over 20 years. And who have you worked for recently? Merrick glanced at Langston, then sighed. Langston Development Corporation. A murmur spread through the room. Ethan jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed to us. Judge Samuel raised an eyebrow at Clint. Mr. Eastwood? Clint nodded. Your Honor, Mr. Merrick came forward last night on his own. He wasn't originally on my list, but after hearing all the testimony, he realized something important. Clint turned to Merrick. Tell the court what you realized. Merrick swallowed hard. He looked at the judge. I realized I didn't want to be part of a cover-up. The courtroom erupted into gasps. Judge Samuel banged his gavel. Order. Ethan's face turned pale. Langston's face turned red. Clint folded his arms. Mr. Merrick, just to be clear, you're saying there was a cover-up? Merrick nodded. Yes, sir. Clint walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. This is the official construction plan Langston submitted to the city. Can you confirm this is the correct document? Merrick flipped through the pages, then nodded. Yes, these are the official plans. Clint leaned in. Was there ever a second set of plans? Merrick hesitated. He glanced at Langston, whose face was burning with anger. Then finally Merrick sighed. Yes, there was a second set of plans. They weren't officially filed, but they changed the property lines. The crowd murmured again. Ethan jumped up. Objection. There is no proof of these so-called second plans. Judge Samuel turned to Merrick. Do you have proof? Merrick reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB flash drive. Yes, Your Honor. I made a backup of all the project files. This drive has both versions of the plans. One legal, one note. The bailiff took the flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. Judge Samuel's voice was firm. We will have this examined immediately. Across the room, Ethan and Langston whispered angrily. You said we had this under control. Langston hissed. Ethan rubbed his face. That was before your own gains betrayed you. Langston clenched his fists. Are we in trouble? Ethan didn't answer. But Clint already knew. They had lost. Clint leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He had seen this coming. Across the courtroom, Judge Samuel let out a sigh and shook his head. His voice was firm when he spoke. Motion denied. The defense had plenty of time to give this court the correct property records. But instead, we had to learn the truth from a whistleblower. He turned his sharp gaze toward Ethan, the defense lawyer. Ethan sat stiffly, his face pale. We are moving on to closing arguments, Judge Samuel announced. Ethan swallowed hard. He glanced at his client, Victor Langston, but Langston didn't look at him. Thomas sat watching, waiting. Ethan took a deep breath, then stood up. He adjusted his tie and walked to the front of the courtroom. He knew he had to try and win them over, even though he felt the case slipping from his grasp. Ladies and gentlemen of Thomas, he began, his voice smooth though not as confident as before. You have seen evidence from both sides. You have heard witness testimony. You have even seen moments of unexpected drama. He briefly looked toward Clint, almost as if suggesting that the actor had staged the whole thing. But Clint remained calm, unreadable. Ethan continued, clearing his throat. But let me remind you, this is not a Hollywood movie. This is a courtroom. A place where facts, not feelings, decide the outcome of a case. He slowly paced in front of the Thomas box, his hands clasped together. Property disputes happen. Land records get lost. Mistakes are made. That is the reality of the world we live in. My client, Mr. Victor Langston, has built his business from the ground up. He has helped bring jobs and economic growth to this town. To paint him as a villain is unfair and an oversimplification. Ethan paused, forcing a polite smile. I ask you to look at the full picture. This case is about a misunderstanding, not a crime. And I trust that you will make the right decision. With that, Ethan gave a small bow and walked back to his seat. The courtroom remained silent. Then Clint stood. Unlike Ethan, he didn't move toward Thomas. He didn't pace the floor. He simply stood where he was, hands resting in his pockets. I don't have a fancy speech, Clint said, his voice steady and calm. No tricks. No acting. He let his gaze sweep over the jurors, meeting each of their eyes. The room seemed to hold its breath. What I do have is a piece of land I bought fair and square. A piece of land I worked for. A piece of land that was stolen from me bit by bit because someone thought they could get away with it. His words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a mix-up. This was greed. Clint turned slightly, looking at Langston. The businessman's face was tense, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. You've seen the evidence, Clint continued. You've heard the truth, from someone who worked inside Langston's company. And you've heard his lawyer trying to tell you this was just a misunderstanding. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But you already know better. Another pause. A heavy pause. That's all I have to say. Clint sat down. The entire courtroom remained still, absorbing his words. Judge Samuel cleared his throat and looked at Thomas. Ladies and gentlemen, the case is now in your hands. He lifted his gavel and struck it against the desk. Court is adjourned until Thomas reaches a verdict. The jurors stood and filed out of the room. The tension in the courtroom was thick. Reporters rushed outside to report on the latest developments. At the defense table, Langston clenched his fists. His expression was tight, his face pale. He muttered to Ethan, "We should have settled." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he admitted. "We should have." Meanwhile, Clint sat still. A younger man might have been nervous, might have tapped his fingers or checked the clock. But Clint was patient. He had been in tough situations before. He knew the truth was on his side. Now it was just a matter of waiting. Thomas deliberated for hours. Clint didn't move. His hands remained folded on the table. His face was unreadable. But inside his mind was sharp. He replayed every moment of the trial, the arguments, the evidence, the testimonies. Across the room, Victor Langston looked more nervous by the minute. He kept glancing at the door to the Thomas room, as if he could somehow will them to return with a favorable verdict. Ethan sat next to him, scribbling notes furiously. He wasn't saying much anymore. He was too deep in thought, trying to come up with a plan. But deep down he knew it was over. Langston muttered, "Maybe they'll come back with a compromise. A smaller settlement at least." Ethan didn't answer. He knew better. Clint, on the other hand, didn't look at Langston. He didn't look at the Thomas room door. He just waited. Then the door opened. The bailiff stepped inside. "All rise." Everyone stood. A middle-aged woman, Thomas Gaines, walked in holding a large manila envelope. She was calm, steady. Judge Samuel nodded at her. "The Thomas has reached a verdict?" She nodded and handed him the envelope. The judge took his time reading it. Then he looked up at the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Thomas has reached a decision. Please be seated." Everyone sat. Judge Samuel cleared his throat. "We, Thomas, find in favor of the plaintiff, Clint Eastwood. We find that the defendant, Victor Langston and Langston Development Corporation, knowingly took land that did not belong to them. They ignored warnings and continued construction on property they did not own. The court orders the defendant to pay full damages to Mr. Eastwood, along with additional punitive damages for their reckless actions." Silence. Then murmurs spread through the room. Reporters grabbed their notepads. Some people gasped. Others nodded in agreement. Clint remained still, his face unreadable. Langston, however, froze. His face turned ghostly pale. He had lost, completely. "Your Honor," Langston said, his voice unsteady, "we request an immediate hold on this decision." Judge Samuel held up a hand. "The Thomas's decision is final, Mr. Langston. If you wish to appeal, you must go through the proper legal channels." Then he turned to Clint. Mr. Eastwood, would you like to say anything before we conclude? Clint stood. He moved slowly, deliberately. Every eye in the room was on him. I've spent a lot of time in courtrooms, he said. Usually in movies. A few people chuckled. But this time it was real. I wasn't acting. I was standing up for what's right. He looked at Langston. Mr. Langston took my land. He thought he could get away with it. But today the truth won. Then he turned to Thomas. And I thank you all for having the courage to see that. Judge Samuel nodded. The court acknowledges the verdict. The defendant must pay the awarded damages in full. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. The courtroom burst into noise. Clint didn't stay long. He nodded to the judge and walked out. Outside, reporters swarmed him. Clint raised his hand. The crowd quieted. Justice was done today, he said. Not because I'm Clint Eastwood. Not because this case got attention. But because the truth was on my side. And when the truth is on your side, you just have to stand your ground. Then he walked away, a quiet hero in his own story. Langston, meanwhile, sat in the courtroom stunned. His world was falling apart. His company's stock was dropping. Investors were pulling out. And worst of all, his reputation was ruined. Clint Eastwood had stood his ground. And in the end, the truth had won. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.